This is Dr. Justina Agnieszka Chevalier. This video is on directionality of interpretation when emotions in self appear in response to thoughts or phenomena in mind, combined also or separated from interactions in person or in correspondence. The cardinal, so principal rule to remember here is that the interpretation is always away from aversion. So when we are trying to interpret occurring in self-emotion or a phrase that the other person said, the interpretation that causes lack of aversion, so non-negative emotion towards good emotions in self, is more correct 100% of times than the one that causes in self aversion or any negative emotion. That is the truth. Because aversion as purpose of communication would impede communication. An example of that is the simplest one. If I would to stick out in a fire hand non-stop, I would develop strong aversion or weakness of that arm and no more capacity to do so, to prevent harm. And that is true for the whole universe. So an example of those books that describe the universe as being intentionally programmed to kill us or harm us are fiction. They're all false. And that is actually possible to be in such state, and it's possible to perpetuate it by interpretation towards aversion that bring aggression in response. But I am going to give now an example. I was not planning to upload more videos because it's 7:55 p.m. in Washington state and I feel tired. I've done so many of those videos, and so it's been just a lot of work, and I'm working on a business plan for a self-sustainable household, and so that is just something that I keep on forgetting. And therefore, if I keep on forgetting that, you all, or at least some of you, either do not know about it or you forget about it. So that's why I'm recording it, and maybe I will add it to either correspondence or to those YouTube videos on non-selective survival versus hyperselective mating, because that is something that I came up with actually driving quite a long time ago through Bishop, California. A directionality of emotions that correspond to locations, and that is a video that is long overdue, perhaps I've done some writing about it, but I forgot. So for example, many of emotions and feelings that bring in self perpetuation of suffering, unwanted suffering, or averted towards suffering itself. So by self, one judges, I cannot stand that suffering, it's gonna get even worse, the person means bad. And so what I've discovered is that, for instance, statements such as "you are looking down on me" mean, in fact, you are simply higher geographically than me, and looking down and that lowering of emotion is because I am standing lower. For instance, I'm shorter, and there is no intended in such a hidden secondary meaning overall. Another example of that is, for instance, medical school of yours is from Mexico, and that intonation that we perceive as contempt, which means contempt, I considered, that is usually the interpretation, I am being considered as in some way not wanted to participate in an activity, or considered in some way because of that Mexican school location worse in quality of education, for instance, or quantity, or or some ways, and that is false. The intended message, even if persons you sometimes do not realize it actually, is that the hiring of so voice up that seems as if it is sarcasm, interpreted as how dare you, for instance, appearing here, is actually to indicate in those angles the location in which the self or presence is deemed by that person as preferential. And so that resentment in the interpretation is that somewhere else you prefer to be than here, and I assume that and reject you based on the location that is higher to you if the voice goes up, or a person that is taller than you, that is in higher need for for such services. And that is not a judgment of inherent worseness or betterness, but in the constant interaction, a statement based on demand in a dynamic way in time for a set of skills, for instance, in non-selective survival where a person or group suffers more, as opposed to that location in which I am speaking about. And then, you do not get me wrong, the emotional response of self decides if that is serious enough to live and go, for instance, towards then Mexico, or it is actually not serious enough, in which case, in self aversion to the pointing out that self is displaced in place and possibly to the person, for instance, group of patients, is not warranted. So in response, aversion in self, how dare you, saying that I am not a good match here, such a response in aversion signifies that over there is non-superior but equal or inferior need for I, and I have information to share with the person speaking to me, whose medical school is of different origins, in a given location pertinent to non-selective survival of that location, superior to the others that location she would be sending me back toward, or he would be. And that is very important example of knowing that, for instance, in many circumstances, laughter that we think is being interpreted as malicious or somebody is laughing, interpretation always is when we try to speculate in mind, which I often do, or feel thoughts passing, or voices sometimes passing, or images passing, which is information, as I've stated, about universe, from the same as thoughts from other sources in more remoter to actual physical senses location. We all have those, and so information you see about then that laughter that we are trying to figure out, establish. So a person laughed looking at my baked potato. And so there are two options: towards personal suffering, which is the person deemed that potato ridiculous in comparison to what that person is eating and would never touch it when I offer. And so that brings in me a perception, for instance, of being rejected as a bad cook or as offering not enough or something bad. When that brings in me suffering, and alternative is away from aversion and suffering in head in interpretation. So the person laughed, and I speculate in my head. That's an anecdote, and the speculation is the person laughed because that person actually is glad that there is additional food, and refused because that person actually does not feel like having potato chips now being eaten. And towards me, a person cares for my well-being and therefore is happy that I am having this potato cooked, and thinks that that potato is appropriate for her and for me, just is eating another form of potato. And the speculation, always remember that, because I tend to forget about it. It's a fact, okay? When we try to figure out in which way to go in interpretation and in responses, it's always away from aversion in interpretation and towards increased elevation of own mood in veracity. Meaning, if we corroborate then the story with that person, the story is always better than the second or X options, which we can, if a person, sometimes we have very active minds and lots of speculation, that kind of ideas, brainstorming, then we can arrange them from the most causing suffering, if that were truth, to most amazing and enjoyable one, if that was the truth, in interpretation of conversations. I'll give you another example. A person, for instance, a plane passed, and a person, a female, responds with aversion or perception of aversion of me staying in a shelter, and the plane is military. So there are two interpretations. A person, per association, does not wish me to share that accommodation because that person, for instance, does not like me, or the person has for the accommodation self-contempt and would prefer to live somewhere else. And you see, when that alleviates own suffering in interpretation, that is what that person means. Or when we perceive emotion, that is what that interpretation of that emotion, with sometimes or without facial expressions, is like. Remember always, because I also tend to forget, we do not own thoughts. So readings of persons that seem like mind impressions of another person and impressions of emotions do not belong to those persons. Persons may agree or disagree on content of passing by their minds and through bodies impressions, be it content based, so having some message that is legit, possible to interpret, or emotional ones. Persons, however, do not, most of the time, we do not create it. If we respond also emotionally in a negative way, that is impossible to help. And interpretation of the prior in the past impression that caused that emotion often is not given or is erroneous, as if imposed. And so that needs to be remembered. It has explanation that I already provided in prior videos, but persons can figure it out by themselves. Quite simple. For instance, suffering animals would prevent good interpretation somewhere. And the idea is to remember always away from aversion in self as interpretation is truther than towards suffering and aversion in self in interpretation of another person, regardless of how aggressive person comes across, actually, for veracity.